So when the Titanic sunk in the icy Atlantic, the wealthy passengers in first class were allowed to get on the lifeboats, and then they paddled to a safe distance, where they then watched the ship go down along with all of its other passengers. And they could hear the people screaming and dying, but most of them, not all, but most of them did absolutely nothing to help. Now, there were 2,224 passengers on Titanic, and you know the story. There was only 1,178 lifeboats. But when the survivors were rescued, there were only 706 people in the lifeboats, which means there were 472 empty seats. Furthermore, some of the lifeboats had a capacity for 60 people, and some of the lifeboats had a capacity for 45 people. And so, could a lifeboat with a capacity for 60 people actually have maybe taken on 61? Or 65, or maybe even in a pinch, 70 people, if especially many of those people were children or smaller women or something like that? My point is not that the passengers or the survivors could have helped their fellow passengers, is that they should have helped their fellow passengers. And to not do so was an immoral or even evil act. That it was an expression of selfishness, entitlement, prejudice, and apathy. And such things should not be present in the people of God. In fact, we are to stand against those things. And oftentimes, those things are perceived as junior sins. But Titanic shows just how heinous they could be. That selfishness, entitlement, prejudice, and apathy directly and indirectly cause suffering on the part of other people. And again, we are to be a people of justice and righteousness. We are not to be defined by those former qualities. And we are to be a people who care about others, who involve ourselves in the lives of other people. And this is one of the major themes that we see throughout the Old Testament, especially the prophets, and especially in the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah is very interesting because, again, if you were to pull out the major themes of Isaiah, I don't know how you could get a much bigger one than this. And here's what's going on. Isaiah is being invaded by foreign armies. And her towns and cities are all being just ravaged. The entire nation is being plundered, and her best and brightest are being carried away to Babylon. And so the people are naturally crying out to God. And so Isaiah wastes no time talking about this. Like in the first 18 chapters of Isaiah, we get to the heart of the matter and to exactly what's going on. And the Israelites are complaining to God because all of this is happening, and they're like, God, we don't understand. Because we're keeping the law, we're sacrificing in the temple, we're keeping all of the requirements of Moses, the religious ceremonies and the festivals, we're doing all of that stuff, and God says, I hate that stuff. He says, I don't want to listen to your prayers, I cannot bear your evil assemblies, is what he says to them. And he says, and it is so because your hearts are not right. He says, yes, you're religious, but you are not righteous, and you are not just. You are not a just people because there is suffering and there is oppression in the land. In verse 4, he says, "Ah, sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption." Verse 15, "Your hands are full of blood." 16 and 17, "Stop doing wrong, learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow." And so people are taking advantage of others. There is widespread and systematic corruption. There's widespread and systematic oppression. People pretend to be godly and righteous while they're taking advantage of other people. In fact, they pretend to be righteous and godly while they intentionally create systems to specifically take advantage of other people. And this is an affront to God, for he cares for the poor and the suffering. We see this throughout the book of Isaiah. Chapter 30, verse 18, "Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. He rises to show you compassion, for the Lord is a God of justice." Isaiah 33:5, "The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He fills Zion with justice and righteousness." Isaiah chapter 42, verse 4, "He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth." In fact, when Jesus is asked to describe his ministry, which he's asked to do on 2 occasions, on both occasions, he refers to quotes from Isaiah. He quotes Isaiah to describe his ministry, and both quotes have to do with how he responds to the poor and the suffering and the disenfranchised. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 18, he's quoting Isaiah 42. He says, "Here's my servant whom I have chosen, the one I love, in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he leads justice to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope." And then in Luke 4:18, quoting Isaiah 61, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And so this is enlightening stuff. This is in part how Jesus views his ministry. And so I wonder if this is not in part how he would have us, his people, his body, his bride, likewise view our ministry as a people of justice and righteousness. That we are to understand that selfishness and entitlement and prejudice and apathy are not junior sins. And not only should such things be absent from us, but we should actively stand against such things when they directly and indirectly hurt other people and cause other people to suffer. And so in this series on justice, I'm searching the scriptures, and I'm trying to find these themes of justice. And so the first week we talked about, how God is just, and we see his justice through judgment. And then last week, God is just, and we see his justice through salvation. And then I found this other theme in the scripture that I just couldn't let go, because it's so strong. And if we're going to be fair, and we're going to talk about the justice of God, we have to talk about how God desires justice in the earth and how he desires his people to be an instrument of justice and righteousness. Again, it is a major theme. God is a God of justice, righteousness, goodness, grace, and compassion. And he desires his people to be a people of justice, righteousness, goodness, grace, and compassion. I don't know how you could read Isaiah and come to any other conclusion. And we see this again through the entire book of Isaiah. And I've read passages throughout Isaiah, several in chapter 1, and then through, and the whole thing reaches a crescendo in chapters 58 and 59. And Israel asked, starting in verse 2, they asked me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near to them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for a man to humble himself. Is not this kind of fasting, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice. This is what Jesus is quoting. And untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I. And so as we look through Isaiah, and then here in this passage, we see that God desires that we be a just people, that we be a righteous people. And he talks about two general responses. And the first one is to have a heart for the poor. To have a heart for the underprivileged, to have a heart for the suffering. And then the second one is to be able to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to speak for the vulnerable, those who are being taken advantage of and do not have a platform, that there's someone who is in a position of power over them who is exploiting them. And so let's start with the first one. That we are to be a compassionate people, that we're to be a people of compassion. And he specifically mentions here the hungry, the homeless, and the naked. And the idea here is that we are to be attuned to the needs of those around us. That we're to be sensitive to the needy that are in our midst, and that we are to bless them as we have opportunity and as the Lord has blessed us. Now, some people say, well, you know, this Old Testament stuff, right? Because you've only been reading from the Old Testament. And so does the New Testament have anything to say about this? Well, I just quoted two passages from Jesus where he's quoting the Old Testament about himself. He's quoting Isaiah about himself. Also, remember the great commandment. Jesus is asked, which is the greatest commandment? Which is first? Which is the highest one? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And he said, the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Doesn't get any more New Testament than that. Or remember the Good Samaritan. Isn't the whole point that we're to help our neighbor in need, even if our neighbor is a stranger? Or the passage that we talked about last week, the sheep and the goats, where a man comes before the Lord and he's being held to account with what he did with the hungry, the homeless, and the naked. Oh, those are the exact things that Isaiah is talking about. Or how about what I believe is our brother Randy's life verse is James 1:27. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress. Now, this concept of being a just people, of being a righteous people, of being a compassionate people, in our society today, the way everything is kind of broken down is kind of a tough one for me, because I've been taken advantage of more times than I can count. I'll just be honest with you. And it makes it hard to help people. I remember when when I was a young pastor, just breaking in. You know, I'm like 25 years old. Don't really know what's what about the world and how a lot of this kind of stuff works. And somehow or another, some homeless people got my name and number. I think they went to the yellow pages and saw our church ad and then cross-referenced that because my name was in the ad, Pastor Gary Bulley, you know. And they cross-referenced that with the white pages. And so one night I get this phone call from this homeless woman who is very sincere and very desperate. And she's in this very difficult situation. It's freezing outside. She has nowhere to stay. And she needs a place to stay for the night. And her whole story was predicated on how it was supposed to be for just one night. And all I needed to do was call this hotel and give them my credit card number, and they would then be able to put her up. And so I did that. I called the hotel, and I gave them my number, and they put her up, and I thought that was the end of it because that's the story. That was the deal. Like, we're going to help you for this one night. And so a month later, I get a call from this very same woman, exact same story, and she needs my help again, just as desperate, just as sincere. And so I help her again. And then the calls began to become more frequent. And then her friends started calling me. And this became a hardship on our family. Like, I'm a new pastor, and I'm literally at this point in my ministry, I made $100 a week. Cindy was working full-time in an office job, and that's how we made ends meet. We didn't have discretionary money. We didn't have this money to spend. And again, it's becoming a hardship on our family. It's just hard to say no when people are in need like that. And so I'm calling the manager of the hotel once again at night, and he finally says to me, I wish he would have said this earlier. He says, you know they're taking advantage of you, right? I said, what do you mean? He said, it's all a scam. He said, their stories are not real. They go through the phone book, and they find people who they think might be sympathetic, and they call person after person until someone gives them a room. And he says, I watch them. And they invite all their friends in the room, and they drink, and they do drugs, and who knows what else in the room. And so it's experiences like that. And I've had many experiences like that. And I've had experiences where I have helped people in a sincere way that have been good. And then there have been times when I've helped people and I turned out where I've been burned. And so it's hard not to become cynical, right? Because you read those articles, you know, like in, you know, they used to be in like Reader's Digest or something. You'd read an article about a guy who was making six figures asking for pocket change at the airport. And I saw a report recently that some panhandler, you know, the kind that they stand out in front of the Target parking lot or something, some guy like that, he's making like $200,000 a year panhandling or something. And I think, you know, every time I see someone who needs help, I ask this question, am I being scammed? You know, is this legitimate? And then I talked to my daughter, like, this is her passion. My daughter actually has a degree in poverty and economics, so that's good. Sometimes I think that all college students have a degree in poverty, but she has an actual degree in poverty from what is the top poverty center in America. And she's now in graduate school at Princeton University studying developmental economics, which is poverty, helping people in need. This is her passion. And we've had numerous conversations about how so much of what we do in the name of poverty is actually counterproductive. And she wants to do what's legit. She wants to do, you know, what is really going to help people. And so I get it, you know, when you don't want to give to the sketchy guy standing on the side of the road and you're like, I don't really know about this guy. I don't really know how to help him. But then we have Isaiah. And it's like, I don't know really, exactly what to do with that. So how do I help? Listen, I think this requires discernment. And you have to be responsive to what God is telling you to do. And I'm not going to be responsible for what God's telling you to do, but you are. But let me share with you some different things that I think that you can do. And some of these are obvious, so please forgive me. But I think it's important and they need to be said. I think first and foremost, we need to make the most of the opportunities that God gives us every day. We come across situations all the time where people need our help, like people that we know, people who are in our lives. And these are an opportunity to express generosity, to express hospitality, to express mercy, to express grace, to be God's hands and feet for someone. And it's not a scam because we know them. Like, we know the situation and we have an opportunity to help. I think another way that we can help is to find legitimate organizations, entities in the community that are doing good work, and they're doing good work, and to support them with your time, your talent, and your resources. Our church has historically had a long-standing relationship, for example, with the Abba House, and they help out women who have fallen on hard times for different reasons. And I know that we have people who have and may still volunteer and help and assist with that ministry. A ministry that over the years that Cindy and I have had a heart for and that we've contributed to, we volunteered, we've helped, is the Peer Foundation. I have a brother with Down syndrome, and they help developmentally disabled people. And so, talk about a disenfranchised group. Talk about a group, that needs help. Probably the go-to place in the county if someone is hungry, if someone needs help with their light bill, is the place. It's over off Pilgrim Mill, exit 16, just on the west side there. You kind of loop around. I don't know the exact name of the street that it's on, but it's a wonderful place to volunteer. It's really interesting. We tried to have a food pantry here at the church for several years, and we couldn't give the food away. And it comes to find out everybody's going to the place, and they're getting food. Another ministry that we have here at the church that I'm sure most of you know about, but you may not know a lot about, is that we actually have a benevolence ministry here in the church, where we help people, and we have a special fund that you can give to and you can designate money to. And the reason you don't know about it is because we don't advertise when we help somebody, because it's all done anonymously, and that's by necessity. But I know pretty much, I think, everyone that we've helped over the years, and we've helped a lot of people through some really hard times. And most of them are people that you know. And sometimes we help people we don't know. But most of the time, it's people that you know who need help, and we've been able to help them. I think another way that you can help the poor and the needy and the disenfranchised and those who are struggling and those who are suffering is to find an international organization that does good work and support them as well. Personally, I like to look for organizations that have feet on the ground and who are doing something that is sustainable long term. And what I mean by that is, yes, there are urgent needs when there's things like hurricanes and things like that, food, water, shelter. And there's a need for that sort of crisis stuff. But if you're really going to help someone, and these are the kinds of conversations I have with my daughter, if you really want to help someone who is involved in systemic poverty, you need to invest in something that provides education, training, and relationships that address like basic health, farming techniques, job training, skills training, micro loans, and all of that as a platform to share the gospel. And our group that went to Honduras, we worked with a missionary who does this. This is what he is. His name's Matt Zell, and we went, and he's building this center in this community up in the mountains with these people who are dirt poor, and he's teaching farming techniques and job skills and all of these kinds of things. And if you've met him, you know he's sharing the gospel as he does this. It's incredible. Another organization that I know is near and dear to several of the people in our church is Compassion International, where they help children, like, not just be fed, but with education, with skills, with other things like this. And, it's not hard. Just Google Compassion International, and they're right there, and everything's about them. Check them out. Go into the watchdog agencies, research them, all that. Make sure it's not a scam, and I guarantee you that it's not. And you're like, okay, how do I help someone who's poor? How do I help someone who's struggling, who's in need? These are things that we can do. And here's the thing. Not any of us are going to be able to do all of these things. Like, on Judgment Day, God's not going to say, did you help all the poor people on earth? I don't think that's what he's going to ask. But he's going to say, what did you do to help somebody? And if what you have, is nothing, because I couldn't help everybody. I don't know about that. The question is, does our heart break for people who are in need? Are we a compassionate people? Listen, the whole point of this is not for me to tell you where to give or who to support and what you need to do with your money. I don't care. That's between you and God. I'm just pointing out that on Judgment Day, I do believe that God is going to ask us how we responded to the needs around us. And I'm sorry to say that when I stand before God, I know there are going to be needs that I didn't respond to, that there are going to be things that I fell way short. But this is something that I think it's important for me, I'm just talking about me, for me to incorporate into my life and have some kind of a plan and some kind of intentionality with that. So that's the first way that God desires his people to express justice and righteousness, specifically spelled out in Isaiah. The second is to stand for those who are vulnerable, to stand for those who are powerless and being taken advantage of. And I'll be honest with you, I almost hesitated to go there because I know I'm wading into some political waters because of the environment that we're in today, and our society politicizes everything. And so let me just state on the front end, I don't think this needs to be, I think it should go without saying, but I want to say it anyway as we start. Jesus is not a Republican and Jesus is not a Democrat. Like, I don't know, as the people of God, if those are the primary lenses through which we should view the world. The primary lenses through which we should view the world is that of the kingdom of God. And so the question becomes, who are the vulnerable? Who are those who are being taken advantage of? Like, the first group that comes to my mind is the unborn. How many millions of babies, let's call them what they are being aborted in America, and how many have been aborted, over the years? It's alarming. Is someone speaking for them? Is someone standing up for them? Another group I think that our congregation, at least people in our congregation, have a heart for are orphans. Like, we tried to have this big event. People didn't come, but we tried to have this big event to do something. We have people who in our church are fostering children, are adopting children. This is a marginalized group in society that needs help. And again, I almost hesitate to go there because of identity politics, victim politics, that kind of stuff. I don't know that racism exists the way that the far left is portraying things, but racism does still exist in America. And there are people who are impacted by that. And it has been a part of our history. And I think it's important how we respond to that as a people. You know, when people ask me who my heroes are, I'm one of those crusty, cynical, early Gen X people, you know, when, in fact, there's a book written by Strauss and Howe called 13th Gen. It's the definitive book on Gen Xers, Raised by Wolves, you know. So I'm like, and one of the things I say about like, my particular window in history is we don't have any heroes. And when people ask me who my heroes are, it's a very short list. And I think probably at the top of the list for me, for a variety of reasons, and not the reasons I think for other people, but for a variety of reasons, is MLK Jr. And he wrote to me just the most remarkable document, and it's called Letters from a Birmingham Jail. And he wrote it extemporaneous, like he's in jail. He has a pen and a piece of paper. And it's a wonderful theological treatise. And then there's this other part where he's responding to pastors. Like he's writing this part to pastors who are critical of his ministry. And here's what he writes. And it's a little lengthy, but I think it's incredibly powerful when you see what he's doing from his perspective and what's motivating him. He says, for years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with our distinguished jurist that justice too long delayed is justice denied. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging dark of segregation to say, wait, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, to see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored, when your first name becomes nigger and your last name becomes boy, however old you are. And when your last name becomes John and your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. The fact that he had to write this to pastors is our shame and our disgrace. The Christian community should have been the first ones to stand with him. And you know what? I need to qualify that. It was Christians who led in the abolitionist movement. Like, you know that, right? It was Christians who led in the suffrage movement. Like, you know that. It was Christians who led the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. It's just not everybody gets on board. And everybody should have, Christians should have been the first ones to stand with him and support him. Now, I'm not a big believer in protests and demonstrations. I believe so much of that is orchestrated today for political purposes. I believe that so much today is so much symbolism over substance. I don't see a lot of concrete stuff being done. What I am a big believer in is making a difference in your life, where you live in your community, by living out the values of the kingdom. And the first value of the kingdom is righteousness. And by treating all people, regardless of race, nationality, gender, orientation, religion, socioeconomics, you name it, with grace, dignity, and respect, because we are all created in the image of God, and we are all worthy of the grace that God has given us, and that we should demonstrate that grace. And so when we see people being mistreated, when we see people being devalued, when we see oppression in its various forms in our midst, then as a just people, we should have a voice in that. Let me give you an example. And this is an everyday kind of example. When I was in grade school, and children are cruel, but when I was in grade school, the other children of my school were especially cruel and aggressive towards people they deemed retarded. And we had this one particular girl in our school who really stood out. And she was developmentally disabled. I don't even know what she was doing in the school, because I think she was much older than the other kids, because she was as big as one of our parents. And she had this very large overformed head. It was twice the size of somebody's a normal size head. And she couldn't speak. She just would make these guttural kind of noises, and that's how she communicated. Her name was Anna. And all the other kids in the school just called her Anna Big Head. And out on the playground, and this happened almost daily out on the playground, before school, recess, after school, they would surround her, dozens of children would surround her, and she would be in the middle, and they would start taunting her and jeering at her and teasing her, calling her Anna Banana and Anna Big Head and all this kind of stuff. And she would become so enraged, and she would lunge at them with these visceral roars. But she was slow because she was disabled, and they could just stay out of reach, and then they would laugh and they would jeer all the more. And I always felt really sorry for her, and I never joined in or anything like that. Because again, I have a brother who has Down syndrome, and I could just almost see him there. But the other thing is, I never did anything about it. I never stood up for Anna. And then one day, and I was second grade at this time, and she disappeared, and she matriculated out of the school when I got a little older. But one day, an older boy did. I don't know the boy, don't know anything about him. I just know this older boy, probably 5th or 6th grade, he jumped in the middle, and he began to shout those kids down. And they dispersed. And that's who the church is supposed to be. The question is, what is just and what is right and what is good? And those are the things that we're supposed to stand for. Throw politics out the window. There are times when righteousness and justice demand that we say something. There are times when righteousness and justice demand that we do something. And if you're confused nationally, do something locally. But the truth is that we often don't get involved. I didn't get involved with Anna. And we don't get involved because we don't want to get involved. And we don't want to get involved because it's messy. and it gets complicated, and it takes us way out of our comfort zones, and we really don't want to do that. And so the question becomes then, so what do we do with this? Isaiah is just going, over and over and over again with this stuff with the Israelites at this time. And again, it reaches this crescendo in verses 58 and 59 when Israel finally repents. And the entire chapter, it's their repentance. And it's super heavy stuff. And then comes chapter 60. And God's response to their repentance. And it's awesome. Starting in verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over all the peoples. But the Lord rises on you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look about you. All assemble and come to you. Your sons come from afar, and your daughters are carried on the arm. Then you will look and be radiant. Your heart will throb and swell with joy. And the entire chapter describes how when they get this right, how their justice and their righteousness will be a light to the nations. And it's the idea that when the people of God carry on God's heart for justice and God's heart for righteousness, when we have compassion, when we stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, it is a witness to others. And God uses it mightily in our lives. I did not plan this message today. Cindy came home this week after the women's Bible study. And she said, I always ask, we always talk about what goes on and everything. And she said, yeah, we talked about like social justice type stuff. And she says we had some differing opinions. And it was all, very cordial and everybody was good and all that. But she said we had some legitimate difference of opinions. And I think that, again, we live in a very politicized type of situation. So, again, I think it goes back to this idea of discernment. And I think there's a question that all of us need to ask for ourselves. Who are the poor, who are the needy, who are the suffering in our world, like in our community? Who is it that needs somebody to show compassion, and then how are we responding to that? And then who are the vulnerable? Who are those who are being taken advantage of because someone in a position of power who has the opportunity necessarily to be fair, to be good, and is not doing that? Who is being taken advantage of by someone who's in a position to do so? And it's not like just one kind of situation. Like, these things happen personally in our lives. Sometimes they happen in our neighborhood or at our workplace. And sometimes they're happening in the larger community or in our nation. And, who are those people? And then, how are we going to respond to that? And some of us are going to come to different conclusions, which is fine because we're going to help different people. Right? Not everybody needs to help the same cause. Again, we can't help everybody. but are we helping somebody? And the excuse that I cannot help everybody is just that. It's an excuse. And so, you know, it's funny how we do in church sometimes. There's like really, you know, popular stuff that preachers can get a lot of mileage of, you know, preaching about and stuff like that. And I'm preaching this because I'm trying to be faithful to the Word of God. You know, and that's why I do these series this way, you know, and I'm studying God's justice, and man, it's in there. Old Testament and New Testament. And think about it. We're God's people, right? We're His body. And we know that He loves people, that we know that He loves the poor, that He is a God of compassion and a God of mercy, a God of goodness. And we know that's His heart. So how do we reflect His heart? I know I just like dumped this big hairy thing in your lap. And I don't know what you're going to do with that. I don't know what I'm going to do with that. But that's really kind of the beauty of it, right? Between us and the Holy Spirit, we respond the way the Spirit is leading us. And for some, it's adopting a child. For another, it's volunteering down at the place. And for another, it's lobbying for the unborn. I mean, I don't know. But are you doing something? Let's pray. Father,